The Latin Mass is better than the new Mass. This is clear to anyone who has actually gone to a Latin Mass, and if you don't believe me, then go to a Latin Mass and see for yourself that it is much better. The Latin Mass developed over centuries until finally, because of the Council of Trent, it was formulated and made universal throughout the entire Church. In Latin, which quite frankly is a better language than any common language of the day. Latin is one of the three holy languages. Hebrew, or Aramaic, Greek, and Latin are the three holy languages. John 19:19 through 20. Pilate also wrote a title and put it on the cross. It read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Many of the Jews read this title, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city. And it was written in Hebrew, in Latin, and in Greek. The Mass is the representation of the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. Not a new sacrifice. I know I have to clarify this. It is the one single sacrifice of Christ 2,000 years ago, made present in the form of bread and wine. And we have three languages nailed to the cross: Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, which are the holy languages. And the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, then in Greek. The New Testament was written in Greek, then in Latin. And the first Bible, the Latin Vulgate, was written in Latin. Exorcists and others in the Catholic Church involved in deliverance ministry report that prayers said in Latin are more effective against driving out demons. One could say that since these three languages were the only languages nailed to the cross, the Mass can only be done in one of those languages. But I'm not going to say that. But I will say that it could indicate a preference. The Mass that came out of the Council of Trent is far more precise than the new Mass. It leaves no room for personal choice, improvisation, or innovation like the new Mass does, which, according to my understanding, is something that the Council Fathers at Trent saw as a problem in the Church at the time, something that helped to lead to the Reformation. And this is why the Council decided to make the Mass precise and universal. But since the institution of the new Mass, we see these same problems again. People questioning the Church's authority, leaving the religious life and the priesthood, people leaving the Church altogether for Protestant churches or other religions, or abandoning faith altogether. Say what you want about the strictness of the Council of Trent or the Tridentine Mass, it stopped the bleeding. For centuries, virtually no one questioned Catholicism who was Catholic, and virtually no one left. And the Church grew. The post-Vatican II Church tries to make it sound like before RCIA, hardly anyone converted, and that's just not true. In the 1950s, conversions were at an all-time high, as well as vocations to the priesthood and religious life. But all that changed within a few short decades after the Second Vatican Council and the new Mass. And now the Church is bleeding again. They tried to hide it, but they can't anymore. The young people are leaving, and a lot of converts don't stay. Why? If the Catholic Church is just another church, no different than the Baptist Church or the Methodist Church, or what have you, then there really is nothing keeping someone from going to one of those other churches, and those other churches are much hipper and have better coffee. Well, that's what the new Mass portrays. We are just like everyone else, except we have old priests and outdated music. In fact, in case you weren't aware, aside from the fact that Archbishop Annibale Bugnini, the man responsible for the new Mass, was a Freemason, the Church brought in Protestant ministers as advisors on the new Mass. Now, I don't really have a problem with Protestants per se. Most of my friends and family are Protestants. But I do have a problem with Protestantism, and I don't think they should have a say in how we worship. But of course, the only reason we would seek the counsel of Protestants would be to Protestantize the liturgy, take out Catholic elements and put Protestant elements in. Well, I'm sorry, I'm not a Protestant, and I don't want a Protestantized liturgy, which is what we have in the new Mass. Now, the idea, we were told, was that once the Church opens the windows and lets fresh air in and reorganizes and becomes more like the world, then the world would accept us, and Protestants and other people were going to flock into the Church in droves. The idea that this was going to happen was prevalent even in the 90s. You could see it on EWTN back in the 90s. Many of the prominent converts to Catholicism, names you would know, were on EWTN talking about this future influx of Protestants into the Church. Well, that never materialized. In fact, the opposite happened, as I've already said. People are leaving the Catholic Church in droves, not joining it. You've heard the statistics. The fastest growing religious group is ex-Catholics. Since I've been Catholic, I've seen the percentage of the American population that is Catholic steadily decline from over 25% to, I believe the most recent statistic is 19%. At what point are we going to admit that this failed? When are we going to admit that we're all going to go to heaven? I'm okay, you're okay. Priests trying to be cool, which is actually kind of cringy, and liturgy designed to please a rebellious generation failed, and it's actually harming the church. Do we have to wait the 100 years that Francis wants? Have you ever noticed that the answer to the problems caused by liberalism is always more liberalism? When are we going to realize that the Mass that helped save the church 500 years ago can help save the church now? And yes, I understand that the Second Vatican Council and the new Mass didn't come out of nowhere. The real problem started about 100 years before, which is why Pope Pius X issued his encyclical on modernism and had the clergy take an oath against modernism. But what the Second Vatican Council and the new Mass did was change the faith, change the church, and that's what's driving people away. Yes, the Latin Mass is better, but is it the only true Mass? In other words, is the new Mass licit or even valid? I've heard people make these claims. They claim that the Catholic Church made the Latin Mass permanent and that there actually can be no other Mass. They usually point to a document by Pope Pius V called Quo Primum, which is the declaration of the Tridentine Latin Mass called for by the Council of Trent in the 16th century. The document reads in part, "Let all everywhere adopt and observe what has been handed down by the Holy Roman Church, the mother and teacher of all other churches, and let masses not be sung or read according to any other formula than that of this missal published by us. This ordinance applies henceforth now and forever throughout all the provinces in the Christian world." Look, I'm no expert on the Latin Mass or the Council of Trent or Quo Primum, though I have read those documents. All I can do is give my observations and opinions for what that's worth. But this sounds pretty convincing to me. However, if this document is unchangeable, binding future popes and councils from ever changing the Mass, it would need to be infallible. And regardless of how strong the language is, if it's not infallible, then it couldn't bind a future pope from changing it, because that future pope would have the same authority as Pope Pius V. Now, there are 5 criteria that must be present for a pope to be infallible. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but I do want to point out 2 of them. First, the declaration must be about faith and morals. This seems to fall under discipline. When the Pope declares something infallibly, he is not making an act of governance or a judicial decision. He is declaring a truth that has always been there, like the Immaculate Conception or the Assumption. And I think it's hard to make a case that the Latin Mass has always been the only true Mass. In fact, we know it wasn't. The Mass was in Greek first, then it was changed into Latin, which actually caused an issue in the Church and caused a saint to become an anti-pope for a while. So it seems liturgical form is not a matter that is unchangeable and universal. There are other rites within the Catholic Church that use different forms of the liturgy, which brings me to the second point of papal infallibility that I want to look at. The declaration must be binding on all Christians, and this clearly is not. In fact, it says so. This new rite alone is to be used unless approval of the practice of saying Mass differently was given at the time of the institution and confirmation of the Church by the Apostolic See at least 200 years ago, or unless there has prevailed a custom of a similar kind which has been continuously followed for a period of not less than 200 years, in which most cases we in no wise rescind their above-mentioned prerogative or custom. The fact that Quo Primum gives an exception, allowing some areas not to have to use that missal, alone indicates this was not infallible. If it's not infallible, then a future pope with the same authority could change it. Now, on the other hand, Father Hess of happy memory, who had a doctorate in Thomistic theology and canon law, says that it is binding, because the Mass is the very life of the Church and not simply a matter of discipline. It is the main prayer of the Church. Pope Pius V also seems to appeal to tradition. Hence, we decided to entrust this work to learned men of our selection. They very carefully collated all their work with the ancient codices in our Vatican library, and with reliable, preserved, or amended codices from everywhere else. Besides this, these men consulted the works of ancient and approved authors concerning the same sacred rites, and thus they have restored the Missal itself to the original form and rite of the Holy Fathers. Pope Pius V says this is a restoration to what the Fathers gave us, not something new or a mere act of governance. That means it is tradition and therefore binding. Father Hess points out that every revision of this missal after Quo Primum and before Pope Paul VI would reference Quo Primum and give their case as to why it is being revised. This indicates that these popes saw themselves as being bound to it. Pope Clement VIII in his revision wrote, Pope Pius V of happy memory undertook, in accordance with the decree of the Council of Trent, to bring the Roman Missal into conformity with the old and purer pattern, and to have it printed in Rome, although he very severely forbade under many penalties that anything should be added to, or that anything for any reason be removed from it. Nonetheless, in the course of time, it has come to pass that through the rashness and boldness of the printers, or of others, many errors have crept into the missals which have been produced in recent years. And Pope Urban VIII wrote, in view of this consideration, following in the footsteps of the Supreme Pontiffs of our predecessors, Pope Pius V and Clement VIII, who undertook to review and restore most diligently the rite and prayers pertaining to the celebration of the sacred mystery, we have ordered that these be again examined, and that if by chance anything, as often happens, has been corrupted in the course of time, it shall be restored to its former standard. So it seems that the revisions of the Missal over the years were attempts at getting rid of errors from printers and whatnot, not an overhaul. It was the same basic Missal since 1570. And of course, new feast days and saints can be added, and readings can change. That's not what Quo Primum is protecting. But what about the exceptions made for rites in use for at least 200 years? Well, the Latin rite isn't the only rite to come out of tradition. And since the tradition includes these other rites, it wouldn't be proper to force the Roman rite on them, which is why Pope Pius V made the exceptions. So this would be a restoration of the Latin rite. But all the liturgical rites in the Church developed over time. Pope Pius V seems to be putting a cap at about 200 years before Quo Primum, which would be about 1370, saying that any liturgical rite newer than that cannot be considered an ancient rite, and therefore cannot be used. So it's not as if Pope Pius V does not put restrictions on these other liturgical rites. But Pope Paul VI, in his Apostolic Constitution issuing the new Mass, did not say that he was correcting errors. This is what he wrote. A new rite of celebration is to be drawn up and incorporated into the pontifical and into the Roman Missal. We wish that these, our decrees and prescriptions, may be firm and effective now and in the future, notwithstanding, to the extent necessary, the apostolic constitutions and ordinances issued by our predecessors and other prescriptions, even those deserving particular mention and derogation. So Pope Paul VI issued a new rite, then at least attempted to make null everything before it. But here's the good news. Pope Benedict XVI said in the motu proprio Summorum Pontificum that the use of the 1962 Missal, which was the last revision of the Missal from Quo Primum, was never abrogated. Summorum Pontificum, Article 1. The Roman Missal, promulgated by St. Pius V and revised by Blessed John the 23rd, now St. John the 23rd, is nonetheless to be considered an extraordinary expression of the same lex orandi of the Church and duly honored for its venerable and ancient usage. The two expressions of the Church's lex orandi will in no way lead to division of the Church's lex credendi, for they are two usages of the one rite. It is therefore permitted to celebrate the sacrifice of the Mass following the typical edition of the Roman Missal, which was promulgated by Blessed John the 23rd in 1962 and was never abrogated. And it still hasn't been. So can Quo Primum be abrogated? Or is it binding on all future generations and the new Mass simply in violation of it? Honestly, I don't know. I see both sides. Both sides have good arguments. I have a tendency to lean towards it's something that a pope cannot bind future popes to, and the new Mass is valid and licit. And I'll tell you why. Because Father Ripperger says that the demons react to the host consecrated in the new rite the same as the old rite, which means that it is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ, which means that the new Mass is valid. And since it is the official Mass of the Church, then it's licit. And if it's valid and licit, then it's good. Because you have the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ, and that makes the Mass good. What's bad is all the other stuff around it. the liturgical abuses, the communion in the hand, and Eucharistic ministers, and all that stuff. But the Mass itself is good. But to be on the safe side, go to the Latin Mass. And if you just absolutely do not have access to it, or in a pinch you have to go to the Novus Ordo, then that's what you have to do. Because you have an obligation to go to Mass under the pain of mortal sin, and we can't play around with that. That being said, I believe that the spirit of the law of Quo Primum is in perpetuity because it says so. Furthermore, by these presents, this law, in virtue of our apostolic authority, we grant and concede in perpetuity that, for the chanting or reading of the Mass in any church whatsoever, this missal is hereafter to be followed absolutely, without any scruple of conscience or fear of incurring any penalty, judgment, or censure, and may freely and lawfully be used. Council of Trent, Session 22, Canon 9 says, "If anyone saith that the Mass ought to be celebrated in the vernacular tongue only, let him be anathema." So they can't take the Latin Mass away from us, even though they want to. We have a right to the traditional Latin Mass. Until my next video, God bless.